Good morning, AP Gov, or good afternoon. Welcome to Federalism version 2.0. This is Federalism. This is Federalism 2.0 Level 2. In Unit 1, we learned about federalism. This is an essential concept we will continue to revisit throughout the entirety of our AP Gov class. The purpose of this activity is to revisit federalism in order to brush up on your knowledge and to ensure your successful understanding of this important concept. As you play the following PowerPoint video on federalism, complete the skeleton notes and corresponding activities you've been provided. You should utilize this PowerPoint level 2 if your knowledge of federalism is emerging. So you got the basics, but you need some brushing up. So let's start with what's federalism? Federalism is the division of power between the national government and state governments. Let's dive a little deeper into that. Press pause, exit out of this recording so you can watch this video for more information, and then come back to this slide when you're done. Welcome back. So, what about those Federalists and Anti-Federalists? Where do they fit in? Federalists were those who, after the creation of the Constitution and during its ratification in the states, believed that the majority of power in the Federalist system that had been created should reside with the national government. These were wealthy, elite, large landowners who were fearful of mobocracy or mob rule. Anti-Federalists were not those who were opposed to federalism. We saw that with the Confederacy, they knew that only having state governments wasn't going to work. Instead, anti-federalists were fearful of a large central government, and so they wanted the majority of power under federalism to reside with the states. None of this should be confused with the federal government. So let's talk about these three terms. We now know that federalism is the division of power between the national government and the states. We know that federalists were those who wanted a majority of power to be with the stronger central government. Federal government is just another name for the national government that we are. So let's talk about why is this so complex. From the ratification of the Constitution well into the 20th century, the elastic clause was utilized to loosely interpret the Constitution by giving more power to the federal government through the use of executive orders, acts of Congress, precedents established by government leaders. For example, George Washington had a cabinet, although nowhere in the Constitution does he say that he may, and judicial review. So let's talk a little bit about judicial review. Judicial review is the Supreme Court's power to review laws made by the other branches to determine their constitutionality. If a law violates the Constitution, which is the supreme law of the land, it is unconstitutional. In the McCulloch v. Maryland case of 1819, Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, John Marshall, a Federalist, determined the national supremacy over states. In the decision, Marshall drew on Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution, which expressly grants Congress the power to pass laws that were, quote, necessary and proper, hence the necessary and proper clause, for the execution of its enumerated powers, thus creating a broad interpretation of this portion of the Constitution and the supremacy of federal laws over state laws in case of a conflict. This is also known as the Supremacy Clause. But wait, there's also the 10th Amendment. The 10th Amendment states the powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution nor prohibited by it to the states are reserved to the states respectively or to the people. We know from the study of federalism and state and federal powers and their conflict that based on the things I mentioned before, like executive order and Supreme Court rulings, this amendment has either loosely or strictly been followed. Let's talk a little bit more about loose and strict construction of the Constitution as it relates to federalism. Commerce Clause is another area where we see both broad and strict interpretation of federal power by the Supreme Court and Congress. Through the 1990s, from the start of the Constitution in the 1780s, commerce was loosely interpreted to mean pretty much anything. With devolution of the 1990s, commerce was interpreted much more strictly in the several rulings by the Supreme Court that we'll look at in just a second. But let's start with the precedent that was set with Gibbons v. Ogden in 1824. The issue was steamboats and states that were taxing the steamboats who were conducting trade on the Great Lakes. In Gibbons v. Ogden, the Supreme Court ruled that because the steamboats were conducting commerce, and because it was interstate commerce between the states, that the states could not tax this commerce because the federal government is responsible for observing and also regulating interstate commerce. So in this specific case, we see a pretty clear definition of commerce, meaning trade. But Chief Justice John Marshall went further to basically state that commerce had to do with anything that impacted the economy, and therefore Congress could pretty much regulate anything, hence a loose interpretation of the Commerce Clause. So as I mentioned, in the 1990s, we saw devolution. Devolution is a shift from strong central government and a push of power back to the states. With devolution in the 1990s, commerce was interpreted much more strictly. Let's look at a few court cases. In United States v. Lopez, 1995, the Supreme Court ruled that Congress had exceeded its Commerce Clause power by prohibiting guns in a school zone. In the United States v. Morrison in 2000, again, the Supreme Court ruled that Congress had exceeded its Commerce Clause power because the activity, in this case, a female student was raped by a male student, did not substantially affect interstate commerce, and therefore it was a state responsibility to intervene. In Alden v. Maine in 1999, the court ruled that its state employees could not sue a state for compliance with federal labor laws. So a state cannot be held accountable for federal labor laws. Okay, let's take a break and test your knowledge. Press pause and complete the Federalist Assignment 2, the Shift of Powers. When you are finished, return to the video and press play. Okay, one more major topic that we need to discuss as it relates to federalism, and that is grants and federal mandates. Grants are federal money or resources given to states by the federal government. Why does the federal government give grants to the states? Several reasons. First of all, money's available. Through things like a federal income tax, the federal government has far more income earning potential than the states in general and is able to provide money to the states. The federal government manages currency and prints paper money. And then, of course, don't forget politics. Local officials benefit from the use of federal monies for local improvements. We've talked about that when we looked at Congress. They generally distribution formulas favor small cities with small populations because there are less people to provide for, but large states also receive a large amount of grants. The final reason why federal government provides grants to the states is it's a way of furthering the national agenda. It's another level that the federal government utilizes to control or manage the states and manage state programs. Generally, the federal government provides money. There are strings attached to that money called conditions of aid. And the federal government then has holds the states accountable and has some control over what's happening in the state. So let's talk about the two types of grants. The first type of grant we studied is a categorical grant. Categorical grant is a federal grant for a specific purpose. An example of that would be to build an airport or for bilingual education. This is a categorical grant. Categorical grants sometimes come in the form of a formula grant, where a federal government pays for a certain percentage of the program, say 80%, and the states are responsible to pay for the rest of the program. Block grant. Block grant is money from the national government, again, or the federal government, to the states to spend within broad guidelines established by federal government. So, for example, a general program that might benefit from a block grant is something like education. The states are recipients of funds from the federal government for education. Now, please note, with block grants, while states prefer block grants because in general they're more flexible and the state can determine how they want to spend their money as it relates to that general category like education, there are still strings attached. So, for example, in the No Child Left Behind era, when the federal government gave money for education to the states, there were several layers of strings or qualifications that the states had to meet. They had to have standardized testing. They had to have standards for their curriculum. Students in grades 3 through 8 had to be tested on the standardized test. Schools had to be identified as needing improvement if their students didn't do well on that standardized test. And then parents had to have an option to choice out of those schools that were in need of improvement. Those are just some of the examples of the restrictions placed on the block grant for education. So we talked about this. States would prefer a block grant because while it still comes with strings attached, it gives them more flexibility in spending. All right, let's talk about mandates. If you're mandated to do something, you must do it. A mandate are terms set by the national government that states must meet, whether or not they accept federal grants. Oftentimes, mandates come in the form of an unfunded mandate. An unfunded mandate happens when terms are set by the national government that states must meet, but it's not funded. An example of an unfunded mandate is the Americans with Disabilities Act. In the mid-90s, Congress passed the Americans with Disabilities Act requiring all public facilities, including those that were run by the states like public libraries or schools, had to be ADA compliant. In other words, they had to be accessible to all people, regardless of disability. So we see wheelchair ramps, elevators, things like that being built, funded by the states. It was an unfunded mandate, but in compliance with the Americans with Disabilities Act. Okay, we've made it. Here's our final conversation. What are the advantages of federalism? Take a moment and jot down some of the advantages that you can think of federalism. So let's start with one. Federalism keeps government closer to the people. If people have the opportunity to participate in government at the local and state level, this will increase their likelihood of organized political activity by constituency. We know our founders were afraid of tyranny, so federalism provides a balance between state and national government powers. We've learned that it's not always pretty, it's not always easy, but it's important in providing an additional layer of checks and balances and separation of powers for our government system. Federalism encourages experimentation. States serve as test labs for democracy to try out new laws. Think about legalization of marijuana in states like California or in Colorado. Think about same-sex marriage. That began to be legal at the state level first. So this is an opportunity to experiment with new laws, maybe try out something that's relevant in one state and not another without the federal government having to act on it. And finally, it's more suitable for a geographically large nation. It would be unrealistic to have all of the power centralized in such a large nation with such diverse people and diverse needs. Okay, congratulations, you've made it. If you are a level 2 student, then once you've completed your notes outline, press pause and complete activity number 3. If you are a level 1 student, you've made it. You've already completed your 2 activities for the day. So once you've completed your notes outline, you may exit out of this presentation. Please remember to go back and review something if you missed it, because as I've mentioned, this is a really important topic. Great job, AP Gov.